I'm going to take us back to the PowerPoint, actually just one final slide from the earlier session and then move on into the world of the young people. So this is just the last slide I wanted to share from Generation Alpha. So remember, these are the under 9s. And that is 3 particular characteristics we see coming out of them at the moment. So they are inclusive, and they are value driven, and they are activists, which Gen Z, who is the generation above them, are also. In terms of the title of the conference, so Raising Children and Teens Who Change the World, I think the value driven and activist nature of our kids and young people is one of the things that, if we can harness it for the gospel, is super helpful. That they are kids who in many ways want to change the world, and we see that in some of the areas that they're particularly passionate about, whether it's wearing a Free Palestine sticker or environmentalism that they're particularly motivated about at the moment. So I think one of the challenges for us in raising Generation Alphas and Gen Zers is to think about how we can use the passion that they have and the drive, which is often concerned to make things right for the sake of the gospel. Well, let me move us into Gen Z then. So this is particularly thinking about our teenagers. So Gen Z are young people who were born between 1995 and roughly 2010 up to about 2015. So with some of the generational studies, the edges are fuzzy. So you'll have some Generation Alphas that actually have more Generation Z traits. You'll have some Gen Zers who will have more millennial traits and a few Gen Alpha traits. So it's that kind of body in the middle. And one of the very striking things about Gen Z, particularly as we seek to raise them both in the home and then to nurture them in the local church, is that they are very different than the millennial generation. One of the things we have, I think perhaps to our detriment in church life particularly, is loving to do things the same way and often saying, well, we've always done it this way and it works, so what's the problem? And I think particularly the difference between millennials and Gen Z mean that we do need to think about how we're doing what we're doing and what they're thinking about. So for example, millennials are the risk-taking generation, the bungee jumping generation. Gen Zers are completely against risk. They are not interested in any way in taking a risk. So if we use the language of taking a risk for Jesus with the millennials, that's brilliant. They totally get it. If we use taking a risk language with Gen Z, we are putting them off the gospel dramatically in using that kind of language. So we do need to know how they're thinking and what's shaping them in terms of each generation. So some big things, and it's worth saying at this point that because Generation Alpha are closely linked to Gen Z, some of what I'm now going to talk about will actually permeate down to Generation Alpha as well. So it's helpful for us to think about it for Gen Zers, but also there will definitely be elements of this in Generation Alpha. So we are seeing much more consistency between Generation Alpha and the Gen Zs than we are between Gen Z and millennial generations. So that's worth remembering, that not only are we thinking about equipping our children to grow up as Generation Alpha kids, we're equipping our children and our young people then to grow up with a mind to some of this that's impacting Gen Z, particularly at the moment. The first thing to touch on is that Gen Z are growing up in a period of history that's just described as post-modernity. You will know that different periods of history have different titles, and it happens to be the period of history that we are alive in today. Interestingly, we could be just moving out of post-modernity, but it probably won't be observable in our lifetime. It'll probably be future generations that look back and see the historical shift. And post-modernity particularly refers to kind of the philosophical air of this time. You'll see there the guy with the t-shirt on, "Live Your Truth." One of the things that is the most striking about post-modernity and this period of history is the fact that we have the erasure of absolute truth. So the category of absolute truth has been removed from Gen Z. And that's why we hear so many things like live your truth, be true to yourself, write your own story. So Gen Z are growing up in a post-truth world. We've seen it a lot on TV recently, notably in kind of the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah, the original one. There was a lot of we need to be true to ourselves, and Oprah reaffirming them by saying, we're glad you're able to live your truth. But actually, this creeps right down into teenage culture, and even educationally, our children are being told to write their own story. You hold the pen, don't let anyone else take control. Be true to yourself. You do you, I'll do me. And so we're living in this world where essentially truth is up for grabs. If I take the concept of truth then a little bit and divide it into two parts, truth is actually in two categories. We have what's called objective truth and then subjective truth. Objective truth is provable truth, essentially. So you're sitting on a chair, it's holding you up. That is objective truth. We know that to be true. You don't step out in front of a bus because you know it'll hit you. That's objective truth. We know it to be true. Then there's the realm of subjective truth. And subjective truth is something along the lines of, I might say, well, the best flavor of ice cream is vanilla. And you might come back and say, well, no, the best flavor of ice cream is chocolate chip. And actually, I'm saying what's true for me, and you are saying what's true for you. And that is subjective truth. And what would have happened historically previously is that Christianity was actually located firmly in the realms of objective truth. It was believed to be absolute truth. It was believed to be provable and true. Some people didn't believe that, but it didn't move out of the category of objective truth. Now, all religions essentially actually are in the category of subjective truth. It's what you decide. You be true to you. And when I mentioned before about the veneering of our children and the kind of the core, the secular core, essentially, to go even further into that, if you dissect their secular core, you'll see because they're searching for their truth, you'll see a whole mix of worldviews. So it's very hard to find someone who's got a pure worldview. Even for those of us who are long-time Christians, our worldview won't be totally orientated biblically. There'll be still bits that we hold onto kind of worldly worldviews, whether it's consumerism or materialism or a touch of feminism, whatever it might be. But with our kids, it's completely different. So one of the illustrations I use is if you imagine going to a seaside town today and buying a stick of rock. You know, the stick of rock has the place of the purchase kind of all the way down it, doesn't it? So if you cut it up, you'll see wherever you buy your rock, bray, 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 all the way down, or cork, 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 all the way down. But if you get to our kids then, so think of that kind of stick of rock as a biblical spine. What we want is biblical, 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 all the way down. But with our kids, what you'll have is that kind of spine, and it will just be all confused. There'll be consumerism, materialism, atheism, agnosticism, veganism, liberalism, all the way through, with then bits of biblical worldview kind of peppered through it. It's almost like someone's got all the separate colors of Play-Doh and mashed them up together. They're so confused. And that's because of this subjectivism. Find your own truth, live your own truth, be true to yourself. And so they're always filtering and observing. And interestingly, one of the things we do see about Gen Z is that they are really good listeners in a way that the millennial generation weren't. So often people will say, if they're presenting the gospel or doing a Christian talk, oh, these guys are listening really well. And they are listening really well. But what they're doing is filtering for their truth. They're not listening wholeheartedly to what you're saying to take it on for themselves. They may take bits and pieces that they like. So with our teenagers, one of the battles is actually for truth, a battle for truth to help them understand that there is absolute truth. So I'll have a young person, a 15-year-old girl, say to me, Mel, I believe with all my heart that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I live for that. And actually, I'm prepared to say I'd die for that. But then in the next breath will say, but I could never say that to my classmate. And that is kind of the nature of what we're living in, kind of this be true to yourself. So she's happy to live her truth. But the category which Jesus makes as an absolute statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that's not subjective. That is objective truth for the whole of humanity and history. But our kids aren't seeing that. And so we need to help them understand what truth is. There is that battle for truth and that kind of selective approach to truth. Now, as a slight aside, you will know that our teenagers, both in Ireland and England, are crippled by anxiety and depression, some of what's called image disorders as well. And this is part of the thing that's going on in a world where they're being told to be their own hero, write their own story, live their truth. They're actually crippled by trying to find out what their truth is. We are people who are not made to actually live our own story. We're made to connect with God's story, to his story, to history. So our story should be part of a bigger picture, the biblical meta-narrative. And that is hugely orientating. But for our kids growing up today who are growing up beyond that biblical meta-narrative, outside of the history of Christianity, they're lost and they're confused. And so there's no wonder that part of the problem is the truth question in terms of the anxiety, depression, image disorders, because they don't know who they are. They're trying to find their identity in a world that's saying, we're not going to help you, you do it yourself. But actually, biblically, we understand that we are meant to find our identity beyond ourselves, but that is on the vertical in relationship to God, not in relationship to the world or to people around us. One of the consequences of postmodernity, of that post-truth thing then, is what's described as relativism. So they are relativistic. Gen Z is very confused about moral and spiritual truth. Relativism is on the rise in this generation, and Gen Z are very confused when it comes particularly to moral truth. If a generation doesn't think moral and spiritual truth exists, then the gospel won't make sense to them. And so we need to understand that, both for helping our own children in terms of they're facing this, our teenagers are facing this, but also their friends are living in this confused way. And so it is going to be very hard to not veneer them and to show them the consistency, the beauty, and the satisfaction that comes through the gospel if they don't get what absolute truth is. And so relativism simply means what's true to you can be true to you, and what's true to me can be true to me, and it's all relevant to the person who holds the belief. The two don't have to be consistent. One of the things I wonder is actually, are we inadvertently teaching relativism to our young people? So we will say things like, this is what Christians believe, or this is what Christians believe the Bible says. You know what, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have been so worried about people saying that. In fact, I often taught people, particularly who do schools ministry, to say that kind of thing. But now, and given the philosophical air that we're breathing, that is clearly a relativistic statement. This is what Christians believe. So we're saying that there are a myriad of choices, there are a myriad of truths, except essentially, but this is the truth that Christians choose to believe. So we need to reassess how we're even communicating the gospel to our young people, and then how we're helping them communicate it to others. Now, I know one of the things that our young people are afraid of is offending another, but we need to help them develop language that puts the gospel and truth into an absolute category in a way that they know, okay, that might cause offense actually, but it's the gospel that's causing offense rather than the person. We're told again in Romans, Paul says the gospel is foolishness to many, so it will offend people. And again, as another little aside, I think one of the problems Western parents particularly have is that we have an idol of comfort for children. We want our children to feel comfortable, to feel safe. But actually, as Christians, we are not to be safe in this world. This world is not our home, and we are not our own. And so we are doing our kids a massive disservice if we're trying to raise them to be comfortable Christians. We're told, aren't we, that we are strangers and exiles in a foreign land, and actually we need to raise our kids that way. And so to try and make them comfortable above all else in this world is going to really do a great disservice to them in terms of helping them to live for the gospel and pursue the proclamation of the gospel to others. The real area that relativism is pressing in terms of our young people is in the area of morality. So that is the moral choices, the moral decisions that our kids make. So morality in this way is determined by Gen Z. So self is the arbiter of morality, and self is the author of personal morality. So that's why you just do what's good for you. And you don't worry about anyone else. And that's why kind of all of the discussions around gender, around ethics, are so difficult for our kids and young people, because they're living in this postmodern relativistic world where actually there's no category of truth. So you can be what you want to be. You can live how you want to live. You can declare what you want to declare, because no one can say other in terms of a competing truth claim. And so with morality, Gen Z are actually being called the generation of liars. And that is because they're afraid to proclaim their truth, the truth of the gospel, to another, because the right belief is the one that doesn't hurt or imply criticism against anyone else. And so we have this kind of group of young people, and this is where it links to what I said earlier on about the kids learning to live dualistically. Our young people are really learning to live dualistically as well because of this stuff. So they're relativizing their faith, just making it personal to themselves. They're being really hard pressed by the kind of moral relativism in the world. And so they're being silenced essentially in proclaiming the truth of the Christian message, the truth which they live by, which is actually making them ashamed of the gospel. Essentially. And so we have young people who are growing up ashamed of the gospel, only prepared to live for the gospel, maybe when they're at church or at home, but certainly not ready to put their heads above the parapet at the moment. And I think the reality is that this world is very cruel. One of the things you've probably heard, particularly coming amongst youth culture at the moment, is, well, it's everywhere, but it's being described as cancel culture. And so our young people are growing up in a culture which is prepared to cancel you if you don't say or do or believe what they want you to believe. And so for our teenagers and for Generation Alpha parents, you've got to be preparing your children for this as well, for living in a cancel culture. But ultimately, Jesus faced the most extreme cancel, didn't he? He was cancelled because of us and for us. And so how do we help our children be prepared to live in a culture that may cancel them, but for the sake of the gospel? Our kids then, as well as living in kind of post-truth, post-modernity, moral relativism, are living in another type of culture, and that's a validation culture. So one of the things that we've seen over the last kind of 10 or 15 years is the increase of what's described as tolerance culturally. And actually, as Christians, we do want to be tolerant, don't we? That should be quite a defining characteristic of a Christian, to be tolerant and loving to all. But actually, that's gone further culturally in the Western world at the moment, and that is we've moved from a tolerant culture to a validation culture. And that simply means that we're being forced to, our kids, particularly our teenagers, are being forced to not just see and hear the truth of another, but actually to validate the truth of another. So to say, I see what you're saying, and I believe that you're saying what you are, who you are, how you're living. So there's a couple of kind of quite famous examples of this. We saw one on the internet a couple of years ago where a young man was walking around a college campus, and he was kind of 6'4", blonde and male, and he was walking up to groups of other students saying, "Can you see that I am a 5-foot Chinese woman?" And they're all looking at him in their minds kind of going, "Pretty sure you're not." But because of validation culture, we have to say, yes, I see that. I see that you are a Chinese 5-foot woman. Another kind of desperate situation that we're experiencing in America at the moment, and this is where validation culture can lead to, is a 60-year-old man who is being tried for paedophilia, so sexual crimes against young girls. But he is saying that he identifies as a 6-year-old girl and must be tried as such. So validation culture will, of course, make us say we see you as a 6-year-old girl, and we identify that you are a 6-year-old girl. And that's where the extreme case of where this is all going. Obviously social media is one of the places our kids are looking for most validation. Our teenagers, they are on it all the time, and this again is really contributing to mental health struggles. Fascinatingly, on the social media and mental health thing, there continues to be kind of pretty robust studies now into the impact of social media on the mental health of our young people. They keep on coming back as inconclusive, that social media is not necessarily affecting the mental health of our young people. But what I've recently read in a report, which I think makes much more sense, is because I think we all know that social media is damaging the mental health of our young people, but it's particularly where young people have a predisposition to mental health struggles or some other governing factors or environmental factors in the life that makes it more difficult for them to hear or see some of what they're seeing on social media. But the particular validation culture of likes, loves, laughs are really important. So young people are, choosing, for example, as they use Instagram, they're actually sending their picture that they're about to post to a group of people, if you like, an approval group, who say whether or not it's okay to put it up, their friends, and then they're asking their friends to like their picture as quickly as they can to show that they are validated. We then have the moral validation, and we're seeing that particularly in things like gender issues and other issues. And I've mentioned already this generation of liars, so they're afraid to proclaim the truth because they long to be validated by others. We're also seeing that Gen Z, and this will be even more true. In fact, for Generation Alpha, it's being described as a pre-Christian world, but for Gen Z, it's described as a post-Christian world. So this does relate to our own teenagers, but particularly also then to those that they're living alongside and those that we're trying to reach. Our young people are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation non-church going families. So they don't even have a knowledge of the gospel. They don't know, who Moses was or what the ark signifies. They certainly don't have any idea about eschatology, about the end times. And so that's a real challenge for how we nurture our children and young people. Previously as well, for our own young people, we would have relied on a kind of a triple-legged stool, if you like, informing their faith life. So home, school, and church. And now for lots of our young people, actually 2 of those legs have been removed. So a school and home, and it's only church that's trying to inform them. And so the biblical meta-narrative, that big picture of the Bible, that big Bible story that I mentioned, is missing even from our own kids. And so they need to figure out life in a way that we're not really helping them. We're not helping them to see where they've come from, who they are, why they're here, what their purpose is here, and where they're going. And even I think, down to something as simple as our Sunday school curriculums, our youth group curriculums, we often just teach the Gospels, maybe a bit of Genesis, maybe with teenagers we do a little bit of the epistles, but we're certainly not best placed to give them that biblical overview, that biblical meta-narrative. And so I think we do need to really think through how we do our ministry amongst young people, as well as individually disciple them, to help them understand the Christian narrative, the meta-narrative, and help them connect to their story with God's story. And there are digital natives, you I'm sure know this, and so this is particularly Gen Z. We mentioned it with Generation Alpha, and it's going to be more pronounced with them as Generation Glass. But with Gen Zers, they were the first generation to be born after the technology, digital technologies were introduced. So digital natives are the generation that was born during or after the introduction of digital technologies, and therefore has a greater level of comfort using it. They're basically the native speakers of the digital language of computers, video games, and the internet. This makes the rest of us who weren't born into a digital world digital immigrants. Now, I never imagined that I would be calling us digital immigrants, but that is what we're described as. So we are stepping into their world. That's how they see us. Sometimes we think of our young people as trying to drag them into our world, don't we? But they see it entirely differently, particularly around this area of digital technologies. So we're the ones that are seeking to step into their world. With the ministries that I've been involved with over the years, I've done lots of training for those who've gone on cross-cultural missions, so to different countries overseas. But actually, the work that we're doing with teenagers needs to be thought of as cross-cultural as well. So we've got to prepare ourselves. I would never send someone to India without preparing them culturally. And it's exactly the same as we seek to speak into our teenagers' worlds. We have to be thinking about preparing ourselves culturally to step into their world. And remember, then, we are the ones that they perceive as stepping in. We don't get it. We don't understand. They're living in a digitally wallpapered world, and we're the ones who still remember getting the very first mobile phone we ever got. We remember getting our first email address. We remember that weird dial-up tone that used to happen when you were trying to connect to the internet, and we remember our mums shouting at us to get off the internet because they needed to make a phone call because there was only one line. So we remember all that, but they have no memory of that. They are fully immersed in this digital world, and so we need to understand how that's informing their thinking and their learning particularly. I mentioned earlier, but this is even more pronounced for our teenagers. They are incredibly formed by social media. The use of social media for our young people is pretty exclusively on Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. That's really where they're hanging out most. You can absolutely bet that out of every 10 young people that you have in your youth group, 9 of them are actively using 2 or 3 of those apps on a regular basis. Take TikTok for an example. If you go onto TikTok, which I'm sure some people are, but I keep on finding that lots of parents and lots of youth workers aren't on TikTok, and it's a fascinating platform for many reasons. But there are different sides. It's described as the different sides of TikTok, and you can get things that are pretty wholesome and not really offensive. But boy, is there stuff on there that is hugely offensive and hugely in contrast to the gospel message. And our young people are imbibing hour after hour after hour of TikTok. They're not just going on and watching one 15-second or 60-second video. They are scrolling for hours, and it is absolutely teaching them. And so things like the transgender agenda, polyamory, so kind of multiple partners, multiple marriage partners, suicide, anorexia, Wicca. I could go on and on and on. All these sides of TikTok are there teaching our young people. And really fascinatingly, with TikTok in particular, it happens a little bit with YouTube as well, is that you don't get a choice. Our kids don't get a choice in what they're seeing. The TikTok algorithm is fully informing their viewing. So all the time, TikTok is throwing rogue things into their viewing to try and attract them into different areas. Instagram and Snapchat, to some degree, you can choose who you follow and therefore what you see. TikTok and YouTube, you're much more at the mercy of the algorithm. And eventually what happens, particularly with TikTok, is our kids can't decide whether they're thinking for themselves or whether the algorithm is thinking for them. And it all becomes a closed circle, where they're seeing things that they think they want, but actually it's what the algorithm wants them to see. And we've got to be helping our kids understand how social media works, how it's changing them and challenging them, and shaping them. Moving on a little bit to just reaching Gen Z, so thinking about how we reach them. This is from a book called Understanding Gen Z by a guy called James Emery White, and he speaks particularly about reaching them for the gospel. And this could be the young people in our homes, but it also could be the young people in our churches. He says, first, they're lost. They're not simply living in and being shaped by a post-Christian cultural context. They don't even have a memory of the gospel. The degree of spiritual illiteracy is simply stunning. Secondly, they're leaderless. Little, if any, direction is coming from their families, and even less from their attempts to access guidance from the internet. So how can they be reached? I hope as you read this, it does give you Jesus's heart of compassion. We're told, aren't we, that as he looks on people outside the gospel, that they are sheep without a shepherd, and we need to have compassion for our children and young people. They are spiritually illiterate, they're biblically illiterate, they are non-book people as well, so they're much more into watching and listening than reading, and so we do need to think about how we are shaping them rather than allowing the post-Christian cultural context to shape them. And I guess Ireland is probably particularly advanced in that area at the moment of the post-Christian cultural context. And thinking on into kind of apologetic for our young people, remember this is again to do with the postmodern, post-truth, relativistic world. So again, White suggests that the days of the apologetics based in evidence is over. So that's really challenging for how we apologize for the Christian faith to teenagers. Instead of, did Jesus rise from the dead? The question now is, so what if he did? Instead of asking, does God exist? The question is now, what kind of God would call for a killing of an entire people group? Instead of testimonies about lives changed to Christ, their question would be why lives currently lived by Christians aren't more changed, but are instead marked by judgmentalism, hypocrisy, and intolerance. And so I think I mentioned this earlier, but when our children and young people come to us to talk about some of this stuff, we need to get our heads around that actually the questions that we may have thought they were asking or we've engaged with the millennial generation or generations above may not actually be their questions anymore, because they're not looking for truth, they're looking for their truth. Previously, what used to happen as we apologized and evangelized for the gospel is that we would present the biblical worldview, someone else would come up against that, and you'd have essentially a worldview clash, which allowed for a brilliant conversation. Now what's happening is we present the gospel because our kids are relativistic, the teenagers are relativistic, they'll just go, that's nice, that's your truth, and it just kind of slides over them or off them. And so we need to be thinking about getting under their skin, trying to unpick their worldview and show how it doesn't work, whilst presenting a Christian worldview that does work. And so the three things that particularly Gen Z say they're asking for is authenticity, connectivity, and relationships. I think that's a real challenge for us, again, in terms of our own family life. If you're nurturing teenagers, how authentic are you about your Christian life? How honest are you? Sean said earlier on about that Sunday faith smiling, happy face that we sometimes put on. And I think we do that even in our homes with our young people. We don't let them into the messiness of life, but then the beauty of the gospel. How do we show them that our own personal devotions are impacting our lives? Do we say sorry to them? Do we seek forgiveness? Do we talk about our own sin? So they're longing for that authentic expression. We have wonderful biographies and autobiographies, testimonies of Christians historically, but they want the lived experience before them here and now. I think those testimonies and biographies and autobiographies will be useful, perhaps in the future, but it's not what Gen Z want, and it's not what they need. They need to see us living real Christian lives. I talked earlier about the idol of comfort that we have for our children, but I wonder if we have the idol of comfort for ourselves as well. Do they see the cost of following Christ in our own lives? In terms of relationships and connectivity, again, the challenge is to bring our teenagers into the intergenerational body of believers, and not to just leave them in that little siloed space sitting over at the side where the teenagers go, and to show them other church families, other church members living their Christian lives, to give rich and real connections. And that's even more important coming out of the pandemic, I think. And then those relationships, how are we fostering significant relationships amongst our young people in the local church and with the whole body of believers? Do you, in your spare time, choose to hang out with other Christian families? Do you go on holidays with other Christian families? Sometimes I think we treat our Christian life like being members of a golf club that we just rock up to at the weekend, and it doesn't impact our whole life. And Gen Z are asking to see that impactful nature of our Christian lives. I realize time's just up, but just a few more things to mention about Gen Z. So one of the things that they articulate is that they feel unsafe and insecure, and that will only have been compounded by the pandemic. There's lots of reasons why they say they feel unsafe and insecure. The question we ask, I guess, is the world any more unsafe, or should they be any more insecure by previous generations? Well, no, the world has always been a dangerous place. It's more how they're feeling. And they are desperate for security, and that's why they are anti-risk, risk adverse. They want to provide security. They want to get a job. They want to buy a house. They want to have a car, and they want to basically secure themselves. And again, that's really challenging for us as Christians, isn't it? Because we know the only place we can be safe is in Christ. There is no security that this world can offer. And we've seen that in the pandemic. Everything that we thought was true and secure and safe was ripped from us. But they're not seeing us necessarily live in a way that expresses our safety and security is found exclusively in Christ. So that's a challenge for us. They are a generation that is diverse, that is in all sorts of ways, culturally, ethically, particularly in their interests and hobbies. So we can't just expect them to be into the same things as other kids. The internet blows that wide open. They can be into all sorts of things, have interests from all over the world. Again, linking back to the theme for today, Gen Zers are success orientated and they do want to change the world. So we need to think carefully about how we're harnessing that for the gospel. They're often describing themselves as the nun, and that simply means that they don't want to be boxed. They don't want to be Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or atheist or agnostic. There's a new category, and that is the nun. Some people will say that's really discouraging. I don't think it is discouraging. I think it's encouraging that they're thinking about it. The challenge more for us is to show that actually that the box, if you like, of Christianity is the right one, that it's the one that makes sense. So we shouldn't be encouraged or discouraged that they're saying, don't put me in your box, but we should be challenged to think about how we show them the perfection of the gospel, the beauty of Christ, and what it means to live for him. I've mentioned already about them being liars. And then the sad and last thing I'll mention before handing back to Ange is that they're actually deprioritizing family. and that is sad, actually, particularly as we're at a family conference. One of the things that Gen Z are doing is creating an echo chamber in the cyber world. And so they'll go to their cyber connections for advice, for help, for validation. And they're much more likely to do that than go to their family. Partly because obviously in a cyber world, you can have a myriad of connections. And as you create that echo chamber, of course, you'll eventually hear what you want to hear. And they maybe don't like the reality of what a family could say to them. I think that is a challenge for us biblically, to re-establish the priority of the family and the role of parents, but also just practically to help our children love being with us and to develop those family relationships that I was maybe mentioning earlier, to treasure the occasions, the memories that come from being in a family, and to make that a priority for them. And I'll stop there. I could talk forever. It's Irish, the Irishness, and hand back to you. People are always surprised in England when I tell them I haven't even kissed the Blarney Stone yet, and I can talk so much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mel. I was laughing when you were saying about the we remember. I remember the telephone coming into the house, never mind the internet and the colour TV coming in. That's how old I am.
Brilliant.
It's a very different world. It's a very different world that our children and young people are growing up in, that I grew up in. Again, just a couple of questions. For young people moving to a new school, would you encourage them to actively tell others they're Christians before conflict arises? And how should they do that, facing the fear of cancelling?
Yeah.
What would you, any advice?
Yeah. So yes, the advice would be, yes, help them to step up and speak up. But you also have to prepare them for what that might mean. If you don't want your kids to be bullied or to be cancelled or victimized, tell them to be quiet, but that's not what the gospel demands. Like, I know kids here who are really suffering actually for speaking up for Jesus, but that is consistent with Christian life, isn't it? That we suffer for the gospel. I realize you want to protect them, you want to keep them safe, but let your home then be the place of safety and of security, rather than kind of school necessarily being that place. So yes, I think I'd want them to step up and the other thing just to say on that, Ange, is it's much easier for kids to face into secondary school, for example, as a Christian, if they already know people in their school who are Christians. So just in church life, I will always encourage kids and youth work to do the transition into youth ministry the year before the transition into school. So for example, if you move kids up to youth ministry, traditionally when they go into first year in school, pull that back a year, move them when they're in sixth class, so that they get to meet other Christians who are in secondary school, so they get to think through what it's like to be a big boy or a big girl at secondary school. So yeah, I think it's really helpful to do all our church transitions the year before the world. What happens if you don't do it early enough is, parents are quite strict for the first few weeks of secondary school. The kids don't know anyone. They begin to get bullied or victimized a little way. And parents are like, oh, this is awful. I'm just going to capitulate to what the world wants and what they want from school. Interestingly, I say exactly the same for mobile phones. I know parents hate me for this, but I'll say it anyway. I actually think we shouldn't wait till first year to give kids mobile phones. I think we need to give them to them a year or 2 years before, even, for exactly the same reasons, to help them know their own hearts in relation to the phone, to help them understand what the phone does to them in certain ways and how to use the phone. Because what I see literally time and time again when kids go to secondary school and they get their phone for the first time is that parents have really strict rules. You can't go on this, you can't go on that, you can't have this app, you can't have that app. Within weeks, the kids are being bullied, or all the social events are being kind of arranged on WhatsApp. WhatsApp has a 16 age rating, in case you didn't know, and your kid can't engage with that. And immediately parents give up and they kind of throw all parental controls out the window then, and it's just a free for all. So the more we help our children know themselves in relation to technology, the better they'll be able to use it. rather than just our policing of it. So yeah, you're seeing what happens when you ask questions, Ange.
It's good. No, it's good. It's good stuff. And you have lots of knowledge there, lots of experience, and very practical. Just one last one. How can we help our young people deal with relativism among their friends when their definition of Christian is different to ours? Today, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering if it's the teenagers' definition of Christian or their friends' definition of Christian is
their friends' definition. It's their friends' definition.
Yes. So I just think we have to really teach our kids about relativism. Like, bottom line is, it's not something that I often hear in either kids ministry or youth ministry, but we have to teach our kids how the world works and how the world is thinking, and the best way for them to reach their friends and actually just love their friends well is to understand how they're thinking, and that is in this relativistic way. So I think put the gospel aside for a minute even, the best way to help our teens love their friends is to understand relativism, understand how they've been taught to think, why they think the way they do. And then maybe how do we help them understand Christianity as an absolute truth claim, rather than a truth claim. So yeah, I would say for those of us in youth ministry to start talking about this stuff. For those who are parents, dig in deep, and it won't help, believe me, if you give a lecture on relativism. That's probably not the way to go, but just to show them where relativism is at work in the world. And to call it what it is, to say this is a relativistic view to morality or to life or to truth. And just ask them, can that be true? We are actually truth lovers, and we orientate our lives by truth. Kids hate people lying to them. That's the best way in, actually, on this whole truth thing, where you talk to kids about being lied to or lying to others. We are truth lovers, and we're made to be truth lovers. So there's lots we can do in terms of exegeting truth. Again, for those of you who do youth ministry, I think before we even get to apologetics and evangelism with teenagers, we need to be doing sessions on truth, on a biblical understanding of what truth is and how we engage with it.
Okay. Thank you, Mel. Thank you
Pleasure.
So much. We've been getting lots of positive and encouraging comments in the chat, so we'll pass those on to you at some stage. Thanks. But thank you for sharing with us this morning. You have a wealth of knowledge, and you know your stuff. You know what you're talking about. So thank you for sharing with us this morning.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. Really nice to see you.
No
all.
problem.